Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. We start off, of course, with the news that developed from last week, and that is South Africa's relationship with the United States is on a diplomatic knife edge as the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee will try and push forward a bill that could see senior ANC leaders hit with sanctions, including travel bans and asset freezes. The proposed U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act of 2025 calls for a sweeping 120-day probe into Pretoria's foreign policy stance, targeting individuals accused of corruption or of acting against American interests. Joining me now, I'd like to welcome the former ambassador of South Africa to the United States, Ebrahim Rasool. Ambassador, always good to have you back. Shukran so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, Faraz, to you and to all your viewers.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Ambassador, given, of course, what we have seen this year, of course, your expulsion, the bit of the hostile reception that President Cyril Ramaphosa had received in May, and of course the tariff hikes, were you surprised or not surprised by, of course, this bill which is being proposed by Republican Representative Ronnie Jackson?
I'm not really surprised, because when I was expelled and declared persona non grata, I was told by senior members of the administration that at that point it was a choice between expelling me and sanctioning the ANC leaders, but that sanctioning the ANC leaders would be a longer and harder process because it has to go through Congress and the Senate and so forth, and they needed to take some action immediately. So I'm not surprised that we are here. I'm not surprised because despite the meeting between the delegation led by President Ramaphosa and Donald Trump, they have imposed a 30% tariff on South Africa, and they have threatened a further 10% because of the very aggressive and assertive BRICS meeting that took place in Rio de Janeiro. And that, I think, has also frightened the administration. And most importantly, I think that the US, and particularly President Trump, is fearing that the world is shifting on the core issue around which they want to punish South Africa, and that is the issue of the humanitarian situation and the genocide in Gaza and Palestine. And South Africa's initial position, where we were lonely, is now beginning to grow, and it is beginning to manifest in the streets even of the Middle East. And that, I think, is what is causing the fear and the panic in the administration at this moment, and that is what has hastened this sanction bill against the ANC leadership.
Ambassador, we are going to touch on, of course, foreign policy in the next segment, but I want to speak about the House itself and, of course, Senate. It's not a foregone conclusion. Of course, there's one side who's, of course, celebrating what this proposal is, saying it's a done deal because there's more Republican representatives than that of Democrats. Of course, there's the other side, which is saying that, look, we need to hold caution because we do not know what's going to happen. And I think the viewers and the public at large need to understand this, isn't it, Ambassador, that this isn't a foregone conclusion and that this has to go to a vote, which occurs in September. And of course, anything can happen when it comes to that.
I think that you are right. It's not a foregone conclusion. The balance of forces may be against South Africa at this moment because there are even some Democrats who have participated, for example, in the genocide, and they may be very unhappy with South Africa's position of taking Israel and charging it with genocide in the International Court of Justice. So we're going to have to work on it. But even some of those liberal Republicans and Democrats may think that sanctioning the ANC and its leadership may be a bridge too far. And so they may win it in the Congress, as they have won it in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and they would hope to win it in the Senate by September, but the Senate, the margins are much thinner than it is in Congress, and that is where South Africa has an opportunity to mobilize its constituencies within the USA. Of course, we do so with very few resources. We don't have an ambassador in place who knows those constituencies. And so we're going to have to do the best we can to persuade the US public, and through the US public, persuade the think tanks and through the think tanks persuade the senators that this is not a punishment that South Africa deserves.
Ambassador, I just want to run through what has been mentioned in the bill, and I want to start off, of course, from a domestic perspective. So according to this bill, the bill is saying, of course, and I quote, it takes issue with the ANC's history of substantial mismanagement of state resources. It says the ANC-led South African government has a history of mismanaging state resources which prove incapable of effectively delivering public service. Now, I asked this question, and of course, there is the Zondo State Capture Commission that is there. It's still lying there. There's questions whether this needs to be implemented or not in terms of going ahead and having it, of course, being taken to the level of prosecution with the National Prosecuting Authority. That said, where does one draw the line in terms of the U.S. meddling in domestic affairs of the country? Of course, it's not new that the U.S. have done this. You just look at the Middle East, you look at countries in Latin America, and the history is there for all to see. But is this really a concern for them that they've brought this forward, inculcating that with the foreign policy stance that South Africa has? Do they really care about what happens domestically in South Africa?
I think, Faraz, your description of it is absolutely correct. It is meddling in the affairs, but it is also trying to compromise the sovereignty of South Africa. And I know that there are in South Africa also people, particularly in our white community, who believe that what the Zondo Commission has said ought to be punished, that President Ramaphosa is too slow, and therefore let the US punish us. You can't have the US punish us because what is illegal in South Africa in terms of state capture is absolutely legal in the USA in terms of state capture. We all know that the USA is captured by lobbies. Amongst others, there's APAC, who determines its foreign policy. Amongst others, it is the sugar lobby, it is the oil lobby, it is the anti-climate change lobby. And those are the ways in which the US itself is guilty of what it is trying to charge South Africa with. But that's just the pretext. That's not the reason that they are doing this. They are doing this because of South Africa's foreign policy choices. And whoever believes that this has anything to do with the well-being of South Africans, not even on the issue of service delivery, the US has no medical help for its frail and vulnerable people. South Africa has free healthcare for its most vulnerable. The US, it is very, very difficult to grow old in the US because they have no public pension system. South Africa under the ANC has a public pension system that looks after everyone over the age of 60, everyone who's disabled, every child under 18. And so we cannot have the US trying to create a case out of South Africa's situation in order to justify why it wants to sanction the ANC and its leadership, because they don't compare at all to what it is. We are a poor country. We do have difficulties. We have had corruption, but there has been no commission in the USA that has called out its corruption. Even now, the Epstein case shows that the judiciary and the Department of Justice is captured because they are all there to protect a president, whereas we had no such protection for a corrupt president in South Africa.
Ambassador, I want to look to the start of this year, and of course this wasn't their first visit. They of course made a very similar visit in 2018. That's Afre Forum. The discussions that happened there, and of course this, and I'm going to mention of course the picture of dead bodies or crosses that were shown in that visit by President Cyril Ramaphosa, which proved to be fake news. I mean, even the BBC and other American media outlets called that fake news. And a lot of it, when you listen to analysts, was down to what was being mentioned by Afre Forum. Does Afre Forum have a bit of blame to take for, of course, this bill being proposed, given what those discussions were, not just this year, but even 6 or 7 years ago?
Faraz, you surprised me with your art of the understatement. They don't have a bit of blame to carry. They are one of the three circles of intersection between three supremacisms. Our erstwhile Afrikaner white supremacism that yearns for the days of apartheid, they have intersected with the MAGA white American supremacism, and they intersect in turn with Zionist supremacism, all three, which are on steroids and which have run mad. And so the point that I'm making is that Afre Forum made that case in 2018 to Donald Trump. They put the idea of a genocide on the agenda. They put the idea of land confiscation on the agenda, all of which have been proven to be absolutely false. They created the impression that there are refugees who need to be assisted from the USA, all of which has proven to be false. And so basically, at that point, they were going to the US to ask that South Africa must be punished, that AGOA must be taken away, that trade deals must be taken away, until they realized by 2024, 23, they realized that they will harm black workers who work in the automotive industry, who are on the farms exporting oranges, amongst others, to the USA, that they will hurt them. But more importantly, they will hurt the white owners of the farms. They will hurt the white owners of the automotive factories. They will hurt the white owners of the manufacturing factories. And therefore, they changed their tune in 23, 24, when they said, no, don't take away those trade deals because you're going to hurt the people in whose name we speak. Why don't you just sanction the ANC leaders? So they carry an enormous amount of blame. And I think if any of these sanctions do come to pass, I will be one of the first to argue within the ANC that indeed that which we are being punished for, we may as well implement. If they punish us for land confiscation, why are we not a bit more bold on the issue of land restitution? If they punish us for a so-called genocide, then why are we not going to make sure that they pay their dues for empowerment for black communities? Because I think that we can't be punished for something that we still are not doing.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool. We're going to be speaking South Africa's foreign policy stance. Do stay tuned. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool on the Republican proposal to have some ANC leaders sanctioned through that. Ambassador, I want to touch on the foreign policy. And of course, let's start off what's happening in Gaza. The statement says that the ANC had, of course, hosted members of Hamas, and this was one of the reasons why this bill was brought. But I find the irony in this. Just a few weeks ago, it was the very same U.S. President Donald Trump that hosted Benjamin Netanyahu, who has an ICC arrest warrant. Ironic, isn't it?
No, absolutely. I think it's more than ironic. It's hypocritical. I think that we are up against a foreign policy that is not rules-based. It is power-based. It is might-based. Whoever has the might can do what they want to and not follow the rules. I think it is a diplomacy of hypocrisy simply because we are accused of hosting Hamas. And of course, our intentions with hosting Hamas would be to ensure that the Palestinians have a way forward for peace and towards a Palestinian state. And so that's what South Africa historically has done on the global stage from the time of Nelson Mandela, because we were in that situation where Hamas and the Palestinians are, we were resisting occupation and apartheid and so forth. And so we know exactly what it is. And so fortunately, South Africa has never blinked on its commitment to that part of our foreign policy. Secondly, we are accused of siding with Russia, which is not the case, but assuming that it is, now that President Trump is warming up to Vladimir Putin, what is the difference between South Africa's position with regard to Russia and the US? And more importantly, Trump has made one of the biggest deals with China in order to save aspects of the US economy, and South Africa is in BRICS with China. So what is the difference? It is most importantly that South Africa is at the center of an emerging multipolar world. The US fears that that multipolar world, the existence of many poles, will translate into a multilateral world in which all of those different poles will coalesce into a resistance to unilateral US trade wars, unilateral US unilateral US support in armed ways to a state like Israel. And so that's what the foreign policy is that is being feared. And I think it would have been fueled by the BRICS summit that completed just a week or so ago in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in which BRICS leaders said that the only way to defend ourselves against a pernicious, unilateral USA is if we stand together.
Ambassador, you've mentioned, of course, this trade deal that the U.S. is looking with China. Of course, U.S. President Donald Trump has not made it a secret. He's willing to sit down and speak with Vladimir Putin. And of course, in the statement, they've mentioned Iran. And both Tehran and Washington are trying to find a way to go forward and complete a nuclear deal. Of course, in trying to make sure that the right amount of enrichment in uranium is done. But the one thing that amazed me, Ambassador Rasool, and of course you were telling me of you came back from Syria, is that Ahmed al-Sharaa, who is of course the current leader of Syria, was on the Al-Qaeda list of a terrorist member. And anyone can go ahead and read that. And here we have the US, who have just lifted sanctions on him. And yet you have Israel, who is, of course, the key ally of the United States within the far right of the government, saying, how dare Washington go ahead and lift the sanctions of Ahmed al-Sharaa, who is an Al-Qaeda terrorist. There's another irony, isn't it, Ambassador?
I think between the US and Israel, there are no principled differences. They all agree that Israel must exist. They even agree, I think, that Israel must exist from the river to the sea. They even agree that there is very little place for a Palestinian state, except with a few Bantustans and a few management committees in the Palestinian states. They even agree that the Arab neighbors, particularly Egypt and Jordan, must be able to take the Palestinians that they want to depopulate out of Palestine, especially Gaza. So there's no principal differences between Israel and the US. There's also no strategic differences because the US is supporting the war effort by Israel against the Palestinians, against Lebanon, against Syria, against Yemen, and so forth. But there are tactical differences that we have seen in the last weeks between Israel and the United States. And the first one is that the United States would want President al-Sharaa of Syria to sign the Abraham Accords and to be part of the normalization. But that does not mean that they will tell Israel to move off the Golan Heights. There are also ways in which tactically Israel now believes that it is the superpower of the Middle East. It can do exactly what it wants to, and therefore it will get as much advantage as it can before there is a comprehensive ceasefire and peace deal in the Middle East. By that time, it wants as much land as possible, whereas the US is saying, don't create too much instability because then it's going to translate into new Daesh, new Al-Qaedas emerging, and we will be the principal target of that. So those are the tactical differences between Israel and the United States. And I think that the issue of that confounds Israel is that they expected President al-Sharaa to behave like a Osama bin Laden. What they are finding out that is more tactically astute than they had thought. He is the one who is leading the efforts, and it's largely because he is under enormous pressure. I drove from Amman to Damascus. I saw the proximity of Damascus to the Israeli border, and I saw how close the Israeli military outposts on the Golan Heights are too. And I was just prior to that on Umayyad Square and saw the ease with which and the accuracy with which they could bomb the Ministry of Defense in Egypt. So Syria has very few options until it is able to consolidate itself into a coherent, united Syria, until it is able to pull together all the militias into a single defense force, until it is able to establish its government as a government that works for all the people of Syria.
Ambassador, one final question. Of course, there are a number of names that are being mentioned that will, of course, be hit with these sanctions. But there's two that I want to focus on, and of course I'm going to come to yours. Dr. Naledi Pandor, of course, she led the ICJ case against Israel at the end of 2023. But of course, your name has been mentioned, and again, this is not confirmed. We have to wait, of course, and see the bill in its entirety when it is presented to the House. Are you concerned, Ambassador, by these sanctions, or is this just the way it is? It's going to be there, whether it goes through or not. You just have to deal with it.
Sanctions scare those who have lots of assets and lots of money and lots of income and are wealthy. It doesn't scare me, therefore. I have faced this wrath of the USA. I've always chosen the side of telling the truth. I have told the truth in ways which are diplomatic, but the fact of the matter is that there is not going to be a threat that I think that should stand in the way of us as South Africa standing. South Africa did not blink in the face of isolation on the ICJ case. And now we are less isolated because big countries are coming behind us. And I think we've got to sit this out. It's a matter of time before most of the world begins to agree with our position and then brings us the kind of relief that South Africa requires.
Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, always a pleasure having you on. Shukran so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Afwan, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
That's Ebrahim Rasool, the former ambassador of South Africa to the United States. After the break, of course, you saw yesterday, early hours of the morning, the Handala, the Freedom Flotilla ship, was abducted. The passengers, I beg your pardon, were abducted on there. They're currently in various Israeli prisons. What is the future with regards to that? I'm going to be speaking to the South African representative of the Freedom Flotilla Coalition, Ismail Mullah. Do stay tuned.